Insurance isn't our only passion at UFG Insurance. We're dedicated to supporting the communities where we live and work. We proudly offer our employees paid time off to volunteer. Their work is making a positive difference across the U.S. UFG's Go Beyond Award is presented to one employee annually for exceptional community service. Striving to deliver on our promises is more than what we do. It's who we are. For a company promising community support, think UFG.
Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to Iowa Ideas 2024. Presenting sponsor is ITC Midwest, and then this is one of the economic development types of tracks, and that is sponsored by UFG Insurance, so thank you to all of them. I am Megan Woolard. I'm the Johnson County reporter for the Gazette, and I will be moderating this panel today on creating new life in old buildings. And I was hoping we could have each of our panelists kind of introduce themselves. We start with Heather, then go Jordan, Pete, if that works.
Well, great. My name is Heather Wagner. I'm the executive director at the Eastern Iowa Arts Academy here in Cedar Rapids. We're a nonprofit, and we've got some exciting things coming on. I'll wait to get to that point, but definitely just thanks for letting me be here and have a chance to talk about what we're going to do.
My name is Jordan Selgren. I'm currently the chair of the Iowa City Historic Preservation Commission. I've been serving on the commission since 2019 and became chair last year. And in addition to that, I'm the art director at Little Village Magazine, and I also appreciate you having me. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Pete Franks, and I am an architect. I oftentimes introduce myself as a preservation architect. Our firm is located in Southwest Iowa in Glenwood. We're a storefront business on the courthouse square here, and the area of specialization that our firm has sort of found the path of least resistance to be is doing rural historic preservation, primarily in Western Iowa.
Perfect. Thank you all for joining us. Since all of you kind of work in a little bit of like different sectors pertaining to, kind of creating new life in some of these older buildings, can you each kind of give examples of, how your work kind of relates to this idea?
Sure, I'll go first. So at the Eastern Iowa Arts Academy, what we're doing right now is we're getting ready to repurpose an old building. So the Arthur Elementary School here in Cedar Rapids has closed, and they moved to a different building. They combined two elementary schools and built a brand new building. So what we wanted to do was to preserve that old building that was built in 1914, and we would like to repurpose it to make it a cultural hub for the arts. And so we are planning on taking our entire nonprofit and moving it over there. And it's going to take a lot to change it. It's completely, it's not ADA accessible at all. And we want to, we have a lot of plans for that. We want to keep the integrity of it being a historical building, yet we still want to bring it up to date so we can have our disabled population be able to be there. We want to, we have a lot of planning to do, and we really want it to be a center that people will come to when they want to bring arts to our community. We want it to be a local landmark for the city, and that's also something else that we're working on. So I'm excited to be here to talk about all of the different aspects that's going to bring.
I'm mostly on the political side of things. I don't have a background in architecture or historic preservation, but joined the commission because of my own outrage at like what I was witnessing in certain areas of development in Iowa City and Cedar Rapids and plenty of other places. And coming from a place of an editorial publishing position as well, I feel like my best position here is to just kind of drum up public support and inform people of what paths they can take to toward preservation. So I actually would love to listen to the experts today more than talk, but hopefully I have something to add.
So I think my 2 cents on this are what what Heather said she's doing specifically with the Arthur Elementary School project. Those are the sorts of things that we're involved with. That when an existing historic building is vacant or is going to go vacant, we will get involved with the project. Usually the first phase of our involvement is to look into just the feasibility of is new use A going to work with building X, and that we look at function, the size and square footage. Is is the existing building adaptable? Are there code and life safety issues that come into play? Is the physical condition of the building suitable for the new use? Those sorts of things, and at least not doing some planning just to see if it's a good fit. And then the $1 million question is always the $1 million question, which is at least preliminarily, and in our case, it's based on previous project experience, largely is what do we think the fair market value of a rehabilitation of the building is going to be for fundraising, or if it's a private developer, for them to be able to meet. And then at that point, the project will either get green lighted and proceed towards design and construction, or many times the project will take a long pause to go into fundraising capital campaign mode. And sometimes the project just it ends up being not right at this time for whatever reason. But even in the feasibility mode, we like to think that we're giving the owner and the building a fair shot at people making an informed decision, so they don't get headlong into a project and run out of money and find that they have turned the project and their financial life into a disaster. So that's an important part of what we do in feasibility mode, is kind of save people from themselves, because the romance of saving an old building is something that's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. And that's something that you can get really sucked into, you're like, oh, I'm doing the best thing ever for this building and the community and the history and all that stuff. But then you've got to look over and you're like, wow, it's going to cost a lot of money. And it really does. And, we're right in that right now with having a capital campaign. Mm-hmm. And that's fun. It's tough. It is. It's really tough when you've got to look at the bottom line.
A line item on my resume that I took off the resume many years ago is I spent about 5.5 years restoring and rehabilitating an 1885 house in Cincinnati when I was a much younger guy. My 25-year-old daughter was brought home from the hospital into a construction site. So, wow. I have kind of walked the walk a little bit and learned a lot about the physical nuts and bolts when I was a younger guy. And that still resonates with me when we're dealing with old buildings now, is that I have insights into how bricks and wood go together and things like that are part of my approach. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of going off of some of that, like, how do we know that kind of a historic building or maybe an older building kind of is, worth repurposing, worth looking into different uses or restoring, or kind of when it's kind of time to, this building isn't really going to work for modern day uses?
I didn't hear the question for some reason. It's chopped for me.
You're good.
Can you say it again?
It was sort of just like, how do we decide when an older or historic building is kind of beyond repair and can't be used for, modern day purposes?
Anybody want to take a first bite?
I was going to say, that sounds like a Pete question.
So I think I have a couple of different answers. One is that obviously, if we're looking at a turn of the century building, for example, one of the first things we look at is just the physical condition of the building. If the roof has collapsed and the floors have collapsed and one of the walls is laying on the ground, it's probably pretty unlikely that things can be reconstructed. Not impossible, but it would take the construction equivalent of medical heroic measures to be able to save buildings when they're in that kind of almost self-demolished state, and that often comes from just owner negligence and failure to maintain them. But having said that, there are buildings and there are owners and communities who will really resort to those sorts of heroic measures if they feel the building is important enough to the community. And we're actually involved with something in Jefferson, Iowa right now that is exactly that kind of situation, where it's a building that by all rights should have been demolished about 5 years ago, and the local community rallied and said, no, we want to save this building, and we want a restaurant back at the ground floor again like it used to have. And a team of local women investors have banded together, and they've been able to pool their own funds and also write successful grant applications. And it's a real phoenix rising from the ashes kind of story that is less about the building than it is about the owner's desire to say, we're going to elevate this thing to a level of importance and do what it takes so it's here for another 50 or 100 years.
Building is that?
The Centennial Building. It's on the corner of the square in Jefferson, on the north side of the square.
Okay. Yeah, I think something also that has come up a lot with us and a kind of a different angle is the environmental benefits of actually restoring an old building. There is a lot of reduction of material waste. There's minimized demolition waste. We're reusing materials. There's a lot of things like that I think that are kind of overlooked when people think, oh, you're having this old building, you're using, like I know in Arthur, for instance, we're using a boiler system, we're using air conditioners in every room, but at the same time, we are also looking into, we're avoiding, urban sprawl. We're keeping I'm trying to think what the word is I'm trying to think of. Reduced consumption of new materials. And there's a lot of plus for some of those things that I think get overlooked when we're talking about, repurposing these old buildings and things like that. There are a lot of pluses for that when it comes to environmental benefits that I think a lot of people just think, oh, let's make it new. And yes, there are a lot of good things about going new, but there are a lot of good things about saving something too.
Certainly. And then kind of in addition to the environmental benefits, I know like there also can kind of be economic benefits as well to kind of repurposing, an already existing structure. Can we kind of, elaborate on kind of what those could potentially be?
Well, I would also say there's lower upfront costs compared to new construction. Economic wise, that would be, I would say, a good benefit. I know for us anyway, it's definitely that'll definitely help us.
And I think it's well known that historic preservation does contribute, it does like add to the sense of community and the economics of a community. It brings people to these places because people are fond of these buildings. They feel like they're part of their life. They have an emotional connection to them. And I don't know, if they're more likely to engage in them or not, but I do think community members are drawn to spaces that have been preserved.
Yeah. I think so.
I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit. I was at a conference earlier this year that was a preservation-oriented conference, and one of the keynote speakers really kind of distilled his message down to the fact that, and this is something I've read in other places lately, so it's a sort of a serendipity thing, that starting with COVID, but still since COVID, there is sort of a national loneliness epidemic that we're all a part of in one way or another. And his imperative was really that downtown revitalization and preservation fills needs that people want to feel connected to where they are in their community, and B, that people want to have pride in their community, and that a revitalized downtown that has some retail and has some restaurants and walkability and things like that are all things that contribute to sort of battling this loneliness epidemic, that if we work and get in our car and go to our suburban house and then go to our office, and that's the extent of our orbit, that the downtown revitalization and the community spirit and the kind of the collective events that happen there, farmers markets and whatnot, those are all things that really meet very, very basic needs that are otherwise not met very frequently in this day in our society. So, you know, there are a lot of things aside from the economic benefits.
Yeah.
And health, you know, these like town centers and historic neighborhoods that were built during, you know, around the turn of the century, were built before cars were the dominating factor in how we put our communities together. And so just walkability and access is a huge, you know, access from the street as a pedestrian is a big factor.
Right.
I got to say, it's kind of, we had a neighborhood meeting, I guess it was about a week and a half or so ago, that we were required to have for the city for zoning and that kind of stuff. And I enjoyed that meeting so much because we had the neighbors came in and got to say their piece and everything. And literally everyone had wonderful things to say about moving in there. But the thing that was so great was they all had their concerns all revolved around what it was going to be like from the outside of that building. They're all excited about what was going to happen on the inside. But what they all really were concerned about is, will the building still look like the building? Will it still have that feel? Will you still keep that outside, that stone sign there that says it was Arthur School? Will you still have the same entrance way? Will you still have, you know, and to me, that was just so telling of what that meant to them, having it sitting there for them. And we said, yes, absolutely. We're keeping all of those things. And they all just were like, thank God, you know, and that meant so much to us and what we were doing, because that to me just showed, yes, they want it to change and morph. At the same time, please don't mess with the good stuff, you know, and that to me was what it's all about. They really, that's their heartstrings, and they have attachments. And a lot of them said, you know, my kids went to that school, or even I went to that school. They don't want to see that. When they drive by, they still want to see their school there.
Yeah, it's emotional. These places,
it's very emotional.
Our lives, you know, and to just destroy them and put up something new. I mean, people are going to bear resentments for the cities that allow those things, the, you know, planning and zoning commissions that allow them, the developers who make money off of them, you know. I mean, all of those factors should be considered. The people who live in these communities should have a say in how the communities work.
And we even had one guy, this was so great. We even had one guy who wrote us an email, and he said, you know, I painted a little mural in the cafeteria there when I was a little kid. And are you guys going to paint over that? Because I still have a helicopter I painted in that mural. Are you going to paint over it? And I said, nope, we're not going to paint over that mural. And he's just like, yes, my God, that mural's going to stay. And I was like, yeah, it is. He goes, that's so cool. And, you know, it was just so funny how I just loved how attached everybody still is to that, because that's part of who they are.
I think the thought that just came to mind for me is historic preservation is a tool in the economic development toolbox, and it's not an either or proposition. There are some buildings, as we said earlier, that are probably beyond the point of no return, and that can be for any number of reasons. So, I mean, we first of all, we have to concede that you can't save everything, but there are lots and lots of buildings that have lots and lots of reasons to be able to look forward to have another 50, 75, or 100 years. And as Americans, we have a very funny idea about history that, we think 1900 is really, really old, whereas if you go to Europe and you walk amongst 500 or 1,000-year-old buildings, their sense of history is much more that, any individual lifetime is a tiny little slice in the life of a building and a city and a society. So something I often say to our clients is that when we're working on a preservation project, if you as the client do your job well, and I as your architect do my job well, and the contractor does his job well, then somebody else can have the same exact conversation in 50 or 75 years and talk about extending the building towards its 300th birthday rather than its 200th birthday.
Yeah.
And that said, I think that there's also, opportunity for just continuity, like to be able to witness the passage of time in a neighborhood. There definitely spaces where historic architecture and contemporary architecture work together, whether it's like additions and modifications to an old building, or just brand new buildings next to old buildings that can be done really well. And those are some of my favorite architectural experiences, when you see like an old brick with a contemporary glass together and they complement each other. I think that is, that would be one of the most exciting parts about being an architect, I think, is that kind of problem solving.
Kind of, going off the problem solving and kind of some of the conversation we had a little bit earlier about, like good neighbor meetings, things like that. How do we kind of make sure that, all stakeholders in terms of, the developers, the city, the community, neighborhood, kind of like have a say or their voice is adequately heard in, conversations around historic preservation?
Well, I know in Iowa City they've done surveys on new developments. I think the same could apply toward reuse of old buildings. I can't think of an example right now where that's been done, but certainly community feedback on how the space could be best be used, especially if there are city funds going into to help with the rehabilitation.
Community engagement is a difficult proposition under all circumstances, because you can have 20 meetings and very few people show up, and the same few people will often show up at the same meetings over and over again. The big trick, and this falls more into really the arena that working architectural historians do. If they're doing a survey for a National Register historic district or looking at a specific building, a lot of times they will be the ones who are doing the community engagement, and that is twofold. One, it's part of their process to just learn additional history and get the anecdotal, oral history kinds of things that don't exist in the libraries and the newspapers. But secondly, it's being able to explain to people that where this research is being done in order to understand the value of the architectural historical assets that exist in the building or in the district or community or something like that. And a lot of times people are going to be very fearful of that because they think the government's kind of coming in and going to tell them what color they can paint their shutters and stuff like that, which is just simply not the case. There's one of the myths about historic preservation that gives us a bad rap among certain circles. But the community engagement, that the biggest part of it is being able to attract people to engage in conversations. And sometimes it's just stopping people on the sidewalk. You know, I spend a lot of time walking around with a camera draped around my shoulder, and people are like, "What are you doing?" And I'm always happy to have that conversation. And more often than not, I learn something about, you know, my grandfather used to come here to get ice cream when he was a little boy back in the 1930s. So all of that's very interesting. The biggest key to community engagement is just being able to listen well and to reassure people that that what they know and what they remember matters, and that the reason why we're looking at a historic property is to hopefully be able to let it have continued longevity and durability.
Yeah, and I think keeping people engaged after the project's completed is very important to celebrate the successes when it's done. Keep people coming back, seeing how it's being maintained, seeing how, you know, I'm a big fan of having events and having people still being very involved in the projects when they're finished, as they're finished.
Perfect. Heather, since you're kind of in the midst of this whole project, can you kind of talk a little bit about like the process for identifying Arthur as like, hey, there's maybe a second life to this building and a new use?
Well, you know, it's funny. For us, we'd been needing to move for quite a while because we're kind of on top of each other where we are currently. And so we were looking at different places to maybe go or move, or maybe we were going to build. So we were just kind of thinking about that. But then when we went and toured Arthur a year or so, oh, it's been over a year, we knew that they were going to start thinking about building their new building. So when we went over there and we walked in and we took a look, and I thought at first, oh, this is going to be too big. It's going to be too big for us. I don't know about that. But then we started really looking at it and we thought, you know what? It's not too big. It's actually perfect for us because we started thinking about, for us, we had to think about sustainability. Like, how can we actually make this work for us? And so as we started thinking about turning it into an arts and cultural hub, we started thinking about how the rest of the community could be engaged in what we are doing. And so we decided to bring in the local artists and the local musicians and people in the community. And so the whole top floor of that school, we're going to make into artist, like a little artist colony. We're going to have it be rental spaces. We're going to break up some of the old classrooms into rental studios. And so we're going to try to bring it full circle for our community and get our community involved. So everyone can, you know, take part in what we're doing. So we kind of saw it as more of a holistic project for our community. We're also going to be having a food pantry. We're going to have a clothing closet. We're going to have a lot of mental health resources for families there. We're going to have a gym. We're going to use the gymnasium. We're going to rent that out for people. We're going to have a kitchen, the old cafeteria and kitchen that they had. We're going to have that be a place that people can come and learn. So we decided to transfer the entire school and keep it on an education level, kind of keep the original use as a place for education and keep that going. So we're keeping it still as what it was intended for education. And so for us, that was kind of a wonderful purpose. And so we thought, you know what, we really are a great fit for being here. So for us on that level, it spoke to us. And we said, this is what we need to do. And so it kind of sealed the deal for us personally. And then we just went full forward. And as soon as the whole staff went, we were in love. And, you know, and we're like, okay, if this doesn't work out, we have to be able to say it doesn't work out. But, you know, we were immediately attached. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but we were. And we decided we're going to do everything we can to make it work.
I know somebody who uh, moved in across the street from Arthur, had a child, was really excited about just being able to walk their kid across the street to go to elementary school.
Yeah.
Was devastated when they announced the closure. But it's so cool how it's gone from being an elementary school, which is accessible to elementary school students and the faculty, to being just this like broad community zone where like so many people are going to be able to have access to the building. And it's just awesome. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it too. And then another thing that, at that neighborhood meeting that I was telling you about, they said, we still want it to have that school appeal, but we also want you to light it up. We want some uplighting. We would really like to see some, kind of lighting on the top. We want to, I really wanted to hear what the neighborhood wanted. So they do want to get it kind of modernized at the same time, to make it stand out and to have that arts approach to it, and to have people be able to drive by and think that's an art center, that's an art place. So really listening to what our stakeholders have to say is incredibly important.
The type of place where you can host a gala.
Yeah, exactly. Or concert.
Yeah.
Jordan can come play.
I'd love to.
Yeah, you're invited.
Kind of generalizing, like outside of just your project, Heather, like how do we kind of identify like what is an appropriate use for, what is an appropriate use for an old building that's kind of getting a new purpose? Like for your example, maybe it wouldn't make sense to have like a department store take over, Arthur's place, like things like that. How do we make sure that we're kind of identifying this is a good building for a new use? Does this new use make sense in this building, in this community? Like, what are some things we have to think about when that happens?
That is a tough question. A lot of people in our case, they were very much against turning it into housing. Mostly that particular neighborhood did not want housing in there. We heard a lot of that. We also heard that they did not want it ever to become any kind of retail, anything like that. They were very much against that. And, I think listening to the neighborhood that it was in was a big part of that. Developers have their own ideas, obviously. The other school that they had closed is going to be housing. And so that was bought by a private developer, and that's what they decided to do. And why they chose that, I don't know. That's their own thing. I don't know, Pete, you'd probably have some better ideas on how people choose what they choose, but I know why we chose what we chose.
Yeah. So I think what I would add to that is every building, we're dealing with existing and particularly historic buildings. So the first thing we need to do is just understand what they bring to the table. How big are they? How are they constructed? What are the things that they have done historically? And then kind of let that inform a search to be able to find what are the appropriate uses that fit in here. And there's an example that I frequently give that is old firehouses make terrific restaurants. And the reason is because the apparatus bay for the firehouse, think about like the firehouse in Ghostbusters, the movie, for those who are old enough to know that reference. The apparatus bay is a big open space, which turns itself ideally into a big high ceilinged dining room with some windows and a lot of crazy character that, the old buildings like that have a lot of soul to them. And then the smaller spaces end up being the kitchens and the other kind of cellular smaller functions that need to be part of it so that's a really a nice example of where we don't just look at the size of the building, but we also look at sort of the configuration and how it lays out to be able to find something that takes advantage and leverages what the building brings to the table and uses it to the future project's advantage. And then the other part of it, obviously, is an economic feasibility issue that, building anything, whether it's a new building or rehabilitating a historic building, is a very resource-intensive process and an expensive process. So, the market forces for developer-driven stuff, we're in a time right now where housing is the thing that we need more of nationally and locally. And so we're seeing lots and lots of schools. We're even seeing office buildings that are being repurposed because there are fewer people who are using, giant swaths of downtown real estate. So there are lots of office buildings that are being repurposed into residential, which is no small undertaking, but that's a reflection of the very soft market for office space and the fairly robust market for residential.
I'd also like to say, so Iowa City earlier this year landmarked the 302 to 316 Bloomington Street property, which is an 1870s kind of J-shaped property. It's the Polly building on Bloomington Street, and it was built in 1875 initially as a hotel and grocery store, and then the back part along the alley is like it was carriage house, and then the stable, is currently a laundromat that serves the entire neighborhood. Within the original hotel and carriage house, there's I think 16 apartments, and then there's the Polly Pizza Restaurant in the front where the grocery store used to be. And of course, we've landmarked this building. It was up for sale before the landmarking process began, and one of the conversations is, well, there could be like some really wonderful kind of rehabilitation and repurposing opportunities, like it could go back to being like this art space. It could be a boutique hotel. We have a lot of need for that in Iowa City, but currently it's serving 16 tenants, 16 families or individuals, as well as an essential service for the neighborhood. So, it could turn into this kind of like community-driven art space, or it could continue serving the community as this like very practical, functional thing that might not be profitable necessarily, but it's important. And that's actually been a point of tension. It was during the landmarking process, which was kind of a contentious process, because while at the same time you want it to be economically viable, you don't want to take away these services that it's providing to people. That said, its original purpose was kind of this community zone. It was a place where people gathered. So it's kind of, we're just going to have to see what happens with the sale, who buys it, who develops it, and what they decide to do.
Yeah, when thinking about, some of these older buildings and, maybe their purpose has changed over the years, but how do we ensure that we're kind of keeping that like historic charm or that feel that, the neighborhood is used to?
That's where historic preservation commissions come in. We've got guidelines, updates on historic properties, and in historic neighborhoods and conservation districts have they like updates to the exterior in particular. It's not our jurisdiction to provide guidance on the interior, but exterior updates do have to meet certain guidelines. This is the part of historic preservation that a lot of residents are maybe uncomfortable with because it regulates what you can do with your property. But in most cases, I would actually say in all cases, it serves to kind of protect the integrity of the architecture and the building itself. So rather than taking out like these windows that were constructed at the turn of the century using old growth pine and replacing them with, vinyl windows that'll deconstruct in the matter of 15 years. Just working with people to help them find people who can repair them or learn how to repair them themselves. So the aesthetic integrity in many cases is directly related to the actual integrity of the way it's built and how long it might last in the future.
Heather, you want to say anything?
Oh, no, I go ahead. Go ahead. You say something.
Okay. So this is another area where we have something that is oftentimes what I refer to as a myth of historic preservation, that the goal of preservation is to take your 1885 Victorian house in Iowa City and try and make it look exactly like it did on the day the first owners moved in. And that's simply not accurate. We understand, we as a movement and as a kind of a philosophical structure, we understand that buildings and cities and neighborhoods change over time, and that's part of being in the world. So when we're looking at a historic building, while it may be very, very helpful for us to have an original photograph of the building in its first episode, in its first few years of existence, the things that are gone or have been changed or been altered over time, more often than not, those are just things that happen through the building's life, and particularly, in small rural downtowns, we see that all the time, that the bakery from 1890 wanted to re-image itself in the roaring 20s to attract new customers and to stay current with the time. And then we'll see another remodeling in the 40s or 50s, particularly at the ground level of retail type businesses in downtowns. And all of that is well and good. And some of those things, even some of those alterations, can become considered historic as well. So what we do when we're meeting and trying to digest a new building is assess what are the historic character defining properties and features that are still here, and how do we work to preserve and elevate those. And then with the new work that we're inserting in doing a renovation type project, what we want to do is be deferential to that historic fabric and try to elevate it and find some harmony between the new materials and the old materials. But we don't ever want to create a false sense of history, which is to undo everything that exists and try and reconstruct something that looks just like it did on the day of the ribbon cutting. And that would be a very unusual situation. If we had like a presidential birthplace where we wanted it to look exactly like it did when the president was a small child, that when you target a very specific time in history and are doing Smithsonian caliber work, but that's 0.1% of historic preservation. The rest of our buildings, we kind of meet them as they are and just say, you got a lot of history, let's figure out how we can keep it and elevate it and amplify it.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Well, I've been talking a lot, so please, you go ahead.
No, you're good. I feel like I've been talking a lot. What you were just saying just made me laugh a little bit, because when we were first looking over at all the little details when we went into school and we looked at the thermostat, this old thermostat was sitting there, and we thought, gosh, that's really weird the way it's applied to the wall. And then we kind of looked under the thermostat, it was loose, and they put a thermostat on top of this other thermostat, which was on top of the original thermostat. They put 3 thermostats on top of each other. And we looked under the very first original one was this brass one with this little, I don't know, it had like a little ticker thing on it that like told how hot it was and cold. Mm-hmm. And I just thought it was so funny because they did not care at all that they just threw another thermostat right on top of it. And I just thought how far we've come you know, and how we see things so differently now and how we cherish things now. Because back then, when they stuck that other thermostat right over it, they literally took a hammer and nails and just pounded right over that other thermostat. They didn't care. They just put a new one up there. And then the next thermostat came and put another one right over the top of that. And I just thought, wow, you know, we really do see things differently. And you know, maybe it is because we are slowly growing older as a country, very slowly. But now we're starting to see that, you know, maybe that original thermostat was pretty cool. Maybe we should go back and keep that. But I agree with what you're saying, Pete, about it. You're not going to get back to the very, very originals. But I do want to preserve that original thermostat. It's pretty cool. I kind of want to get, I kind of want to unveil that thing.
Well, so in the college block on the Ped Mall in Iowa City, there's what used to be the soap opera, which is the facade of it has kind of an Art Deco, like a very glossy black tile facade. And that I think is a 20s, 30s update. And that was incorporated into the rehabilitation of that block when they after they landmarked it. And that was it's just such a huge part of the facade of that building. People love it. And if I can only imagine if, like, you know, they were forced to take it back to the original, there would have been a lot of protest because it's so special and it shows the evolution of a space.
That is a cool, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's beautiful.
And that also ties back to an earlier comment that, you know, there is definitely a compatibility between historic buildings and particularly historic downtowns and business districts where we have density. There's a compatibility between new buildings and old buildings. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm an architect and I work mostly on historic buildings, but I have colleagues over the state who think that what I do is really weird because they're building new buildings every year. And, you know, we just are doing different things and being able, again, like one of the kind of big sweeping philosophical positions of preservation is that it's not trying to hold up history, it's trying to allow history to continue to happen. So when new things are inserted or buildings are rehabilitated, that's just part of history doing its work. And, you know, furthermore, I think one of the motivations behind working with old buildings is so that, you know, our grandchildren's grandchildren can come back someday long after we are gone and be able to look and say, some of this was here when grandpa was here or when great grandpa was here. And that's kind of the larger mission of preservation, is being able to say that, you know, these buildings are a symbol, a durable symbol of the history of the community, and something that will hopefully survive the sweep of time like that.
We have to preserve that storytelling.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a really cool example of contemporary and historic in Indianola. It's the Carnegie Library, and it's now Des Moines Metro Opera property, I believe. And there's like a contemporary build on the back of the building, and it's so completely different. And the differences really just bring out the beauty in both parts of the structure, and it's just awesome. I went through there on RAGBRAI this year, and I was just absolutely taken by it, just heart eyes. So I love to see that. I love to see the evolution. I love to see like the kind of like adventurous risk taking and how things can complement each other.
I mean, another building that's a really terrific example is the Des Moines Art Center. Right, we have an Eliel Saarinen building, and he was a rock star in the early 20th century, and then it's also accompanied by a Richard Meyer edition and an I.M. Pei edition, both of whom were complete rock stars of their time. And you know, all three of those at this point are considered to be sort of historic and compatible with one another. So that's an example of sort of how museum buildings and things that are meant to be monumental can also grow and change and not have to be static once the first building is done. Art Institute of Chicago, similar but on a bigger scale. They are working on yet another major addition with a top shelf name brand architect. And, you know, it's the nature of successful institutions, at least, that things keep on growing because they need more room to accommodate their success.
Kind of as we're kind of getting close to time and wanting to wrap up, like, where do we go from here? You know, we have these conversations here. What do you want people in the audience to kind of take away from what we've talked about today?
Historic preservation needs funding. You know, prioritizing funding in local, state, federal government, but really, you know, local, speaking to your city council about how important it is to you. I think that's a huge part of how we were successful in landmarking the Poly Ice building and moving forward with new preservation initiatives. Like, we really need public support. We need the public to convince council that this stuff is important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think something to take away is about the fact that repurposing something is more than just about renovation. It's so much more. It's not just about fixing up an old building. You know, it's about reimagining its whole purpose. Because I think people are, oh, they're just going to fix up that building. It's going to be, you know, great. No, it's really, you know, it involves a lot of thoughtful planning. It involves a lot of creativity and a lot of collaboration. You know, it can make a very functional space, a very imaginative space, a very meaningful space in the end, I think. So I think that really understanding that it's more than just a renovation. It's something that can be a very meaningful thing for your community to do something like this.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something I said kind of towards the beginning, that we as human beings have an inherent and intuitive sense of wanting to belong to our place and connect to it and find meaning there. And the historic buildings and historic downtowns and things like that, it is something that we're naturally attracted to, just like we're naturally attracted to daylight. And so I think it fills a very fundamental human need. And as I said earlier, it allows people to connect and have some common denominator with their neighbors and friends, or even just strangers on the sidewalk. So that's a real important thing. The other thing I was going to mention is that, you know, I said earlier that we have sort of a strange sense of history compared to our European colleagues. That historic preservation in this country is a relatively young proposition. The National Historic Preservation Act was signed into law in 1966. So we're less than 60 years old for it being something that the federal government recognized as an important thing to do. And in some ways, I've always found that to be connected with the run up to the bicentennial, where the federal government made a very wise decision of saying we're going to make this a national celebration of history and heritage, not just about Boston and Annapolis and New York. And so a lot of people in the bicentennial years started to get interested in history and heritage. And we saw a lot. I mean, there's a lot of people in the historic preservation field who are retiring out now because they were part of that first wave in the 70s. And, you know, there was a period not too many years earlier than that where old buildings were looked at like last week's newspaper, where they were just like, what, you know, what, we want to cover them up or tear them down because they're just ugly and old. And fortunately, we have kind of repositioned that, at least in some portions of the society, that people realize that these buildings are cool and have possibilities and can live a lot longer. So that's real interesting to me. And hopefully that's a trajectory that will continue. that people will increasingly be interested in finding those connections to place in history. The other thing I was going to mention is that we as I said before, we make kind of a short-term impact. So what we're doing in preservation is sort of like a relay race where we can do what we can for 30 or 40 years of a career, and then hopefully the next generation will be able to take the baton and continue to run with it. And that's how we get 500-year-old buildings at some point in the future.
Yeah.
We're kind of getting close to time here, and I want to be respectful to everyone, to all of you and those who came. Yeah, thank you to all of you panelists for spending, the first hour of your morning with us. I really appreciate it. I know everybody here is really thankful that you took the time to come and do this.
It's fun to talk about. It gets me excited about everything. I love this is a great subject.
Perfect. Yeah, well, thank you to all of our audience members for coming. Thanks for all the sponsors of this session. We do have a couple more sessions this afternoon if you guys are interested in that, and then the conference will kind of be wrapping up this afternoon. So thank you all for taking the time again. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody that made this happen.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about something that all three of us have a lot of passion about, obviously.
Yeah, we do. Good group.
All right, everyone. Have a good rest of your Friday and weekend as well.
Thank you, Megan.
Very good. Thank you, Megan. Thank you.